I didn't do anything wrong. At least, nothing that can be proven. There were no messages left, no touches, no nights I can't explain. But I know how badly I wanted something I shouldn't, and that desire didn't feel innocent. That's what keeps me awake. I'm a woman in a long-term relationship that looks stable from the outside. We live together, share routines, talk about the future like nothing is wrong. I wasn't looking to cheat. I wasn't looking for attention or excitement. I wasn't trying to cross any lines. But one situation made me realize how close I came to wanting something forbidden, and how quietly it changed the way I see myself. Nothing happened, yet everything felt different after that. What would you have done in my place? Do you think desire alone can already be a form of betrayal? If you enjoy real, uncomfortable stories like this, subscribe and share so more people can join the conversation. I need to be clear about something before anyone jumps to conclusions. I didn't wake up one day wanting to betray my partner. There was no plan. No buildup that felt dangerous at first. It started in a way that feels almost embarrassing to admit. Normal, everyday moments, short conversations that lingered a little longer than they should have. A look held for an extra second. That subtle awareness that someone was paying attention to me in a way I hadn't noticed in a long time. At home, everything was fine. Not perfect, but real. Comfortable, predictable. We talked about work, about bills, about weekend plans. Nothing was broken enough to justify what was happening in my head. And that's what scared me the most, because the desire didn't come from loneliness or neglect. It came from curiosity, from the feeling of being seen in a slightly different way. I told myself it was harmless, that thoughts don't count, that as long as I didn't act on anything, I was still being faithful. But there were moments when I caught myself replaying conversations, wondering what would happen if things went just a little further. Not physically, not yet, but emotionally, mentally, and every time I did, I felt that quiet tightening in my chest. That was the first time I realized something uncomfortable. I wasn't fighting temptation. I was managing it. And I don't know when managing desire stopped being the same as resisting it. Was I already crossing a line by letting those thoughts stay? Would you consider this a betrayal? Even if nothing happened? What made everything harder was how ordinary it all felt. There was no dramatic moment where I told myself, this is dangerous. No clear warning sign that something had crossed into forbidden territory. It blended into my routine so quietly that I barely noticed when it started to matter. I'd find myself checking my phone more often. Not because I was waiting for a message, but because I liked the possibility of one. That small anticipation, that tiny rush that came from knowing someone might reach out. Not out of obligation, but because they wanted to. And that's when the guilt began to feel heavier, because at the same time, I was sitting across from my partner at dinner, listening to him talk about his day. Nodding, smiling, being present. Nothing about our life together had changed on the surface. Yet inside, I was holding something I wasn't sharing. I started editing myself, not lying outright, just choosing what didn't need to be said, telling myself that privacy wasn't the same as secrecy, that everyone is allowed their own thoughts. But there's a difference between having a private thought and protecting it. I noticed how careful I became, how I'd angle my phone away without thinking, how I'd close certain tabs faster than necessary, how my body reacted before my mind could catch up. That scared me. Because it wasn't about being caught. It was about the fact that part of me didn't want to be seen. I kept asking myself the same question late at night, staring at the ceiling. If nothing is wrong, why does it feel like I'm hiding? And the worst part was this realization. I wasn't hiding from my partner. I was hiding from myself. That's when I understood something that made my stomach drop. Desire doesn't announce itself as betrayal. It shows up quietly and waits to see if you'll make room for it. And I had. At what point does wanting become a choice? Do you think secrecy begins before any real action does? I started paying attention to myself in a way I hadn't before. Not out of self-care, but out of awareness. The uncomfortable kind. I noticed how my mood shifted depending on whether there had been contact that day or not. How certain moments felt lighter, sharper, more vivid. Simply because I was carrying a thought that wasn't meant to be shared. That scared me more than any message ever could, because it meant this wasn't happening to me. I was participating in it. I told myself over and over that wanting isn't the same as doing, that desire lives in the mind and actions live in the body, that as long as I kept those two separate, I was still being loyal. But late at night, when everything was quiet, that logic didn't hold up. I would replay moments in my head. Not fantasies exactly, but possibilities. What if the timing were different? What if I were someone else? What if this line didn't exist? And every time those thoughts appeared, I didn't push them away. I let them sit. I let them breathe. That's when the shame crept in. Not loud, not dramatic, just this low, steady awareness that I was feeding something I didn't intend to starve. I began to understand something unsettling. Desire isn't always about wanting another person. Sometimes it's about wanting a version of yourself that feels more alive, more seen, more dangerous, and that version of me felt intoxicating. At the same time, I'd catch glimpses of myself from the outside, laughing a little too quickly, checking my reflection more often, feeling this subtle charge in my body that didn't belong to my relationship. I hated that part of myself, and I protected it anyway. That contradiction sat heavy in my chest. Because if I was truly innocent, why did it feel like I was already bargaining with my own conscience? Why did I feel relieved on days nothing happened, and disappointed on days nothing did? That's when the thought hit me, sharp and undeniable. I wasn't waiting for something to happen. I was waiting to see how far I could go without crossing a line, and the realization that followed was even worse. I didn't know where that line was anymore. Is it still innocence if you're quietly testing your limits? Would you stop yourself, or keep pretending nothing is happening? The first time I felt real fear wasn't because something almost happened. It was because I realized how calm I was inside the situation. There was no panic. No sudden urge to stop everything, just a quiet awareness that I was walking in a direction I shouldn't find familiar, and yet, it already felt that way. I started justifying things in my head before anyone asked me to. That's when I knew something had shifted. I told myself I was allowed to feel desired, that wanting doesn't cancel commitment, that I was still choosing my partner every day in all the ways that mattered. But the truth is, I was choosing comfort over honesty. There were moments when I caught myself rehearsing explanations that no one had requested, practicing answers to questions that hadn't been asked, not because I planned to lie, but because I wanted to be prepared. Prepared for what, exactly? I couldn't say. What disturbed me most was how normal it all began to feel, how quickly my mind adjusted to holding two versions of myself at the same time. The woman in a stable relationship, and the woman quietly aware of her own hunger. I didn't feel reckless. I felt controlled. That's what made it dangerous, because control can look a lot like responsibility from the outside. And from the inside, it can feel like permission. I remember one specific moment that keeps replaying in my mind. Nothing physical, nothing dramatic, just the weight of proximity, the way the air felt thicker, the awareness of what could happen, sitting right between us, unspoken but understood. I didn't step back, and I didn't step forward. I stayed, and that choice, that pause, stayed with me. Later that night, lying next to my partner, I felt the contrast so sharply it made my chest ache. The safety of something known, the pull of something forbidden. And instead of relief, I felt confusion, because I hadn't been tempted by a person. I had been tempted by a feeling, the feeling of standing at the edge of something and not turning away. That's when the question I'd been avoiding finally surfaced, clear and unavoidable. If I don't stop myself when I still can, who exactly am I choosing to become? Is staying silent the same as choosing the risk? At what point does restraint turn into consent? I started noticing how my body reacted before my mind had time to correct it. That's what frightened me the most. It wasn't excitement in the obvious way. It was subtler than that. A slight tightening in my stomach. A heightened awareness of my surroundings. That quiet alertness you feel when something matters more than you want it to. I told myself I was being dramatic. That everyone feels attraction sometimes. That commitment doesn't erase instinct. But this didn't feel like instinct. It felt like intention forming slowly, patiently. I became more aware of timing. of moments when we were alone without planning to be, of how easily I adjusted my schedule without consciously deciding to, and every time I noticed it, I felt that same internal split. The part of me that knew better, and the part of me that didn't want to stop. What disturbed me wasn't the desire itself. It was how carefully I made room for it. I began setting rules in my head, unspoken boundaries that felt reassuring because I was the one defining them. No touching, no explicit words, no crossing lines I could clearly point to. Those rules made me feel in control. They also gave me permission, because as long as I stayed within them, I could tell myself I was still doing the right thing, still being loyal, still being good. But there was a lie hiding inside that logic. I wasn't asking myself what was respectful. I was asking myself what I could get away with, internally, morally, without forcing a decision. And that realization sat in my chest, like something heavy and unmoving. I noticed how I felt after those moments ended. Not relieved, not satisfied, restless. Like I had opened a door inside myself and then pretended not to notice the draft. At home, my partner would talk about small, ordinary things, and I would listen, really listen, and feel this sharp, quiet guilt pressing against my ribs. Not because I had done something specific, but because I knew I was no longer fully present in the same way. I wasn't divided between two people. I was divided between two versions of myself, the one who believed she knew her limits, and the one who was testing them in silence. And the hardest truth of all was this: if someone had asked me in that moment to stop, truly stop, I don't know if I would have felt relief or loss. Is setting rules the same as staying faithful? Or is it just a way of delaying a choice you don't want to make yet? At some point, the tension stopped feeling abstract. It stopped living only in my thoughts. It started showing up in the smallest, most revealing ways. I caught myself smiling at nothing, feeling distracted during conversations that used to hold my full attention, replaying moments in my head that didn't deserve that much space, and yet they took it anyway. That's when I realized something uncomfortable. I was emotionally rehearsing a version of myself I hadn't chosen yet. Not because I wanted to leave my partner, not because I was unhappy, but because part of me was curious about who I could be if I allowed myself to step just a little further. That curiosity felt dangerous, precisely because it didn't feel desperate. It felt calm, thoughtful, almost reasonable. I remember telling myself, "I'm still in control." That phrase became a quiet mantra. I used it to soothe the guilt, to justify the silence, to avoid asking harder questions. But control is a fragile thing when it's built on avoidance. I noticed how carefully I curated my reactions, how I measured my tone, how I weighed every word before saying it, not out of respect, but out of strategy. I was managing impressions, managing expectations, managing myself. And yet, underneath all that effort, there was this steady hum of awareness. If nothing changes, something will. I began to feel that familiar knot in my stomach whenever I imagined being confronted. Not caught, confronted. Asked to explain something I had never explained even to myself. What would I say? That I didn't mean for it to matter. That I never planned to act. That wanting isn't the same as doing. Those answers sounded thin even inside my own head. The truth was harder to admit. I liked the tension. Not because it was sexual in an obvious way, but because it made me feel awake, present in a way that routine sometimes dulls without asking permission. And that realization came with shame so sharp it made my chest ache, because I loved my partner. Truly. And yet, I was entertaining a version of myself that didn't fit cleanly into the life we were building. That's when I understood the real risk. It wasn't that I might cross a line someday. It was that I was slowly redefining where that line lived, quietly, privately, without consensus. And once you start doing that alone, it becomes very easy to convince yourself you're still on the right side of it. I went to bed that night with a thought I couldn't shake. If I keep telling myself this isn't a choice, am I just choosing without admitting it? When does curiosity turn into commitment to the wrong direction? Would you trust yourself if you were thinking these thoughts? That's when the secret started leaking into places I didn't expect. Not through words, through absence. I noticed how my partner would ask simple questions, and I'd hesitate for half a second longer than normal. Nothing noticeable enough to accuse, just enough to create distance. I became quieter. Not withdrawn, just slightly less available. Part of my attention was always parked somewhere else, even when I was physically present, and that hurt more than I thought it would, because I wasn't trying to pull away. I was trying to hold everything together, but carrying something alone has a cost. I started feeling irritated over small things. Not because of my partner, but because I was constantly managing myself, monitoring reactions, correcting expressions, making sure my face didn't reveal what my mind was busy with. It was exhausting. There were moments when my partner would reach for me, casually, affectionately, and I'd feel this sudden rush of guilt so strong it almost made me pull away. Not because I didn't want him, but because I felt undeserving in that moment. That was new. I'd never associated intimacy with shame before. And yet there I was, lying next to someone who trusted me completely, wondering how much of that trust was built on the version of me he thought he knew. I hated that thought, and I hated myself for having it. What made it worse was how easy it would have been to stop everything right there. No dramatic consequences, no irreversible damage, just a decision. But instead of making it, I stayed suspended. I told myself I was being careful, that I was protecting my relationship by not acting on anything. That silence was restraint. But deep down, I knew I was confusing restraint with avoidance, because restraint is active, avoidance is passive, and I was very good at being passive. I remember one night in particular, sitting across from my partner, watching him talk about something that mattered to him. I nodded, asked questions, laughed at the right moments, and all the while, there was this quiet voice inside me asking if he knew what was going on in my head right now. Would he still look at me the same way? That question stayed with me long after the conversation ended, because the answer didn't feel reassuring. It felt like something fragile was already cracking. Not loudly, not visibly, but in a way that couldn't be undone once noticed. I wasn't betraying him with another person. I was betraying the version of myself he believed in. And once I saw that clearly, I couldn't unsee it. Is withholding part of yourself a form of dishonesty? Would you feel betrayed if you were in his place, even without proof? The pressure didn't explode all at once. It tightened, slowly, relentlessly. It became harder to tell where the anxiety was coming from. Some days it felt like guilt. Other days it felt like fear. And sometimes it felt like grief for something that hadn't happened, but somehow already felt lost. I started asking myself questions I had avoided for weeks. What was I actually protecting? My relationship, or my self-image? Because the more I sat with it, the clearer it became that silence wasn't neutral. It was doing work for me. It was keeping things exactly where they were, suspended, unresolved, safe from consequences, and safe from truth. I caught myself imagining two different futures. In one, nothing ever came out. Life continued as normal. We stayed together, built plans, grew older side by side. In the other, I said something. Not everything, just enough to be honest. That second future terrified me. Not because I thought it would end us, but because I didn't know who I would become if I had to speak out loud the parts of myself I had been hiding. Once you name something, it becomes real. And I wasn't sure I was ready for that. There were moments when I felt almost relieved that nothing had happened, as if the lack of evidence meant I was still safe, still good, still deserving. But that relief never lasted, because every time my partner trusted me, casually, instinctively, it landed heavier, like a reminder I hadn't asked for. Trust is easy to accept when you feel clean. It's unbearable when you don't. I started sleeping worse, waking up with that familiar tightness in my chest, already bracing myself for a day of pretending everything was fine. And the worst part was this. On the outside, everything was fine. No arguments, no distance he could name, no obvious signs of trouble, which meant the conflict lived entirely inside me. And internal conflicts are dangerous, because no one can intervene. No one can stop you. No one can pull you back. You either face them, or you let them quietly reshape you. I began to realize that eventually, I would have to choose between two kinds of pain. The pain of honesty, unpredictable, immediate, exposed, or the pain of silence, controlled, slow, corrosive, and I didn't know which one I was strong enough to carry. Is choosing silence still a choice, even if you tell yourself it's for the best? Would you rather face a hard truth now, or live with a quiet lie forever? The moment I realized I couldn't keep going like that didn't come with drama. It came with exhaustion, not physical tiredness, emotional fatigue, the kind that settles into your bones when you've been carrying something alone for too long. I was tired of monitoring myself, tired of measuring my reactions, tired of living with a version of me that only existed in my head but affected everything I touched. I started noticing how often I held my breath without realizing it. During conversations, during quiet moments, even when nothing was happening. That's when it hit me. This wasn't sustainable. I wasn't standing still anymore. I was eroding. There's a particular kind of fear that comes when you understand that doing nothing is no longer neutral, that the absence of a decision is becoming a decision in itself. I kept asking myself the same question, over and over. If I truly believed I hadn't done anything wrong, why did it feel like I was waiting for forgiveness? That question shook something loose inside me. Because innocent people don't rehearse explanations. They don't brace themselves for conversations that haven't happened. They don't carry this constant awareness of being one question away from collapse. I thought about what honesty would actually mean. Not a confession designed to ease my guilt. Not a version polished to sound harmless. Real honesty. The kind that risks changing how someone sees you. And I realized how selfish I had been in my silence. I told myself I was protecting my partner. But in truth, I was protecting myself, my comfort, my image, my ability to keep things exactly as they were, admitting that hurt more than anything else, because it forced me to confront the possibility that I wasn't the person I liked to believe I was, that my values were real. But fragile. I sat with that thought longer than I wanted to, and slowly, something shifted, not toward courage, not toward confession, toward responsibility. I started to understand that the real question wasn't whether I had crossed a line. It was whether I was willing to keep redefining myself around avoiding one. And that's when I knew the next step would hurt, no matter which direction I chose, because staying silent meant becoming someone I didn't recognize anymore, and speaking up meant risking everything I had built. There was no clean way out, only an honest one. If telling the truth cost you something real, does that make it more necessary or more selfish? At this point, what do you think I owe more? My relationship or my integrity? I didn't wake up one morning suddenly brave. There was no surge of clarity, no heroic decision. What finally pushed me wasn't courage. It was the understanding that I was already living with consequences, just ones no one else could see. I realized that even if nothing ever came out, even if my partner never suspected a thing, I would still be living with a version of myself shaped by silence, a version built around avoidance instead of honesty. And that felt like a slow kind of loss. I asked myself one last question, the one I had been circling for weeks without daring to answer. If this is who I am when no one is watching, is this who I want to be trusted? I didn't owe my partner a dramatic confession designed to ease my guilt, but I did owe him the truth about where I stood. And more than that, I owed myself the chance to stop lying quietly, so I made a choice, not to explain every thought, not to confess desire like it was an accident, but to confront what mattered before it turned into something worse. I chose honesty over comfort, not because it guaranteed forgiveness, it didn't, but because silence was already costing me something I couldn't afford to lose, my sense of integrity, my ability to look at myself without flinching. I don't know if this decision saved my relationship. That part isn't the point. What I know is that I stopped pretending that wanting something forbidden doesn't change you. It does. And pretending otherwise is how people drift into places they swear they never meant to go. I didn't do anything wrong in the way people usually mean it. But I came close enough to learn something that still stays with me. You don't have to cross a line to lose yourself. Sometimes, standing right next to it is enough. Do you think I made the right choice in the end? If you enjoy real, thought-provoking Reddit-style stories, subscribe to the channel for more.